Hello and welcome back to the JW Thoughts channel. My name is Wally, and today we have some exciting and yet, at least in my mind, inevitable news, because we have a MP, a member of the British Parliament, who is raising awareness of Jehovah's Witness problems in their organization. So some pretty exciting stuff. This came out about a week ago, and I was trying to make an effort to get in contact with the individuals involved so I could maybe do an interview or something, get a little bit more details about the road going forward. Those attempts unsuccessful so far, so I figured we would just rip it and I could give you what I found out so far. So let's jump right into it. So just for a little bit of context before we jump right into the clip that's specifically talking about the Jehovah's Witnesses, why it's being brought up in the first place, the Secretary of State for the Home Department, not entirely sure what that means, but I don't really understand the British political system, so you'll have to bear with me. But the Secretary of State for the Home Department, she was raising issues the day before about some problems with a inquiry that Britain did a couple of years back. It was called EXJW. I think it was the nomenclature that most people use for it, and some problems with what they were doing going forward with some of the information that they were gathering, whether or not they were implementing any of the suggestions that were made from the findings of that survey, that study that was done. This is all related to CSA. So when she's bringing this up, there was a heated debate, some back and forth. It was actually, I mean, I'm not one to tune into C-SPAN or anything like that, but I was on the edge of my seat. I had my popcorn out and I was taking sides. I was shaking my fist. So let me just show you a couple of clips just so you can see that this is a very spirited discussion, and the people involved in it are very passionate about seeing changes come and reform coming into British institutions.
Taken together, this will mark the biggest programme of work ever pursued to root out the scourge of grooming gangs and child sexual exploitation. Those vile perpetrators who have grown used to the authorities looking the other way must have no place to hide. And so groom children, whether their crimes were committed decades ago or are still being committed today, can end up behind bars. But alongside justice, there must also be accountability and action. We've begun implementing the recommendations from inquiries past, including Professor Jay's independent inquiry, and we've said that further inquiries are needed to get accountability in local areas. I told the House in January I would undertake further work to look at how to ensure those inquiries could get the evidence they needed to properly hold institutions to account, and we have sought responses from local councils too. We asked Baroness Casey to review those responses, as well as the arrangements and powers that had been used in past investigations and inquiries, to consider the best means to get to the truth. And she recommends that the inquiry should be time limited. But its purpose must be to challenge what the audit describes as continued denial, resistance and legal wrangling among local agencies, and we will set out the further details on the national inquiry in due course.
And finally, Mr. Speaker, we didn't need to commission a report to tell us what we already knew. So will she apologise on behalf of herself, the Labour Party and the Prime Minister for wasting so much time and voting against this, dismissing the concerns of the survivors? The House, the British public, and most importantly, the many brave survivors deserve clear answers from a government of dithering and delay.
I have to say to the Leader of the Opposition, I don't think she can have read this report and the seriousness of its conclusions, because it sets out a timeline of failure from 2009 to 2025. Repeated reports and recommendations that were not acted on child protection, on police investigations, on ethnicity data, on data sharing, on support for victims. For 14 of those 16 years, her party was in government.
including years when she was the Minister for Children and Families, and I didn't hear her raise any of these issues until January of this year.
So I think one of the major concerns is that they had this large study done, they had a lot of data collected, and no one really did anything with it. It never really moved the needle in any significant way, and it seems to have just been sitting on people's desks for years. And so the antagonist here of the plot line comes in and is like, hey, are you going to apologize? And then she has to be quickly reminded that, weren't you the secretary for some children or whatever initiative? And I haven't heard you raise any of these issues until January of this year. Now, it's my understanding that Yvette was recently appointed to the position that she's. I don't know the entire scope of everything, but you can find out on your own. I'll put some links if you do want to watch this whole discussion in the... Oh, man, that was like a weird half burp. Not really. I don't even know what that was, but I'll put some links in the description so you can check it out for yourself. Anyway, with that being said, let's move forward to the next day where someone who is an MP, it's my understanding that it's the youngest MP in British history, perhaps, and he is an ex-Jehovah's Witness. So enter Sam Carlin.
We'll introduce mandatory reporting for child sexual abuse, one of the key recommendations from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which I'll abbreviate as ICSA for the remainder of this speech. That is a long overdue measure and one long called for by our Labour Home Secretary and the Prime Minister personally. However, I remain concerned that the government is not going far enough on the issue of mandatory reporting, and that is why I have laid 3 amendments to the bill on that subject, numbered 10, 11 and 22, which my speech today will focus on. These are not intended to change government policy, quite the opposite. These amendments are intended to deliver the government's stated policy, to implement the ICSA recommendations relevant to the Home Office in full. The Home Secretary stated in January that this was the government's intention. And she reaffirmed that just yesterday, actually, in response to my question on her statement, with a firm yes, after I asked if it remained her policy to implement them in full. But there are 3 significant gaps in our plans to implement Recommendation 13 on mandatory reporting, where the bill is not delivering what ICSA recommended. With these gaps, I am concerned that the duty to report will be ineffective in some of the settings where it is most needed, religious groups in particular, and I will use the example of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the religious group which I grew up in, to illustrate how and why. They have a deep cultural distrust of secular authorities, and that leads to a culture of dealing with everything internally, as happens in a lot of different religious groups, including child sexual abuse, and reporting nothing to the police. Furthermore, their internal processes for doing so are atrocious. For example, there's something called the 2-witness rule, which means they take no action on any report of wrongdoing unless there are 2 witnesses to it. There are never 2 witnesses to child sexual abuse. I give this context to highlight why the mandatory duty to report must be absolutely watertight, as ICSA recommended, to prevent people in leadership organisations, or in leadership of organisations like this, from avoiding it. We have put a definition of religious leaders into our schedule in this bill, but it requires them to have, and I quote, regular unsupervised contact with children to be subject to the duty. That will allow virtually any religious leader, be they paid clergy or a volunteer elder, like in the Jehovah's Witnesses, to escape the duty, as very few have regular unsupervised contact with children, despite being in a very significant position of power and influence. And I personally happen to know at least one person who actually was sexually abused as a child in that organisation. They went to speak to religious elders about it in the presence of their parents, and not unsupervised, and they were advised that to go to the police would mean bringing reproach on God's name. So no report was made, either by the victim, their family, or those religious elders. This is commonplace. And under the bill as currently drafted, there's no sanction for that. The elders aren't mandated reporters, and even if they were, the proposed offence under clause 73 around stopping someone else from making a report, which I very much welcome for the record, only applies to other mandated reporters. So if someone pressures a victim, or their parents for example, not to make a report, that won't be illegal. So that offence needs to be broadened too, and I know the NSPCC are calling for the government to consider a broader offence of concealing child sexual abuse, which I urge the government to give serious consideration to, and I may give some more detail on that later.
So here we are in the House of Commons, which is, again, my understanding that this is where any new bill, any laws, they are going to be initially debated, talked about, voted on, and then those are going to go up to the House of Lords, and maybe some counts and duchesses will come in after that. But jokes aside, this is like where it will start gaining traction, and people are going to debate and talk and start voting on it. So this is just the first little baby steps here. But how interesting it is, but I think it's inevitable. It is inevitable that these situations will come up, because it is an objective fact that the Jehovah's Witnesses as an organization have fundamental problems with negatively affecting people's lives. This is a major one. A major one is how they deal when there are allegations of CSA. Historically and currently. And as he brings up, they have this rule that's like this 2-witness rule. How insane in 2025 that there is a 2-witness rule with an established tax-free organization that claims to be speaking for God, and yet they have this absolutely brain dead. And I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. Even from the Bible's own perspective, it makes no sense. And yet they stubbornly hold on to this. So these are questions that inevitably will be asked when there is sufficient public awareness about the problem. This just happens to be someone that grew up as a Jehovah's Witness, and so they are able to bring that front and center. But that's why talking about it, that's why any news coverage that can be done with the Jehovah's Witnesses, anyone that wants to speak up and raise awareness of this, it is so vital and so important, because the farther away from the public perception that Jehovah's Witnesses have had for so long of being, well, they're nice people, but a little goofy, instead of it being they're nice people and a little goofy, that can be shifted when people actually tell their stories and say, no, this organization is dangerous. They're dangerous for a lot of different reasons. And one of those other reasons is because of their disfellowshipping policy. And so he's actually going to be interrupted by a different MP that's going to ask him about this.
So if there's time, I will give way.
Cameron Thomas.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He's making very important points about, particularly about the Jehovah's Witness cult. And one of the methods that they use to ensure that issues like this don't escape from the organisation itself is the act of disfellowship, where an individual is threatened by being disfellowshipped all communication with their own family. And I wonder if he'll go a little further into recognising that too. Thank you.
Sam Carling.
I absolutely will, and I very much thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. I'm very pleased that other Honourable Members in the House are aware of that issue. It's something I am trying to do some work on separately. I think it is certainly relevant to what I'm discussing here. Just to give the House a little more context on that, what that essentially means is if that organisation decides that someone has committed a serious sin, it can essentially tell all of their family and friends to cut them off permanently.
My man, Cameron Thomas, steps up, and the first words out of this guy's mouth, I was wondering about this Jehovah's Witness cult and their practice of disfellowshipping. How cool is that? That they are here in Parliament, and he is calling the Jehovah's Witnesses a cult. I think that's really, really cool that he's the one that brings it up. It feels like maybe a little tag team issue. I don't know if this was a plan. He was like trying to throw him the softball so he could knock it out of the park, or if he's someone that is just intimately aware of what is going on in that organization, and he just wanted to. He's like, oh well, if you are a former member, you must know more about this. I don't know the whole context or the situation or anything behind it, but hopefully in the future we can get someone on the channel to discuss it a little bit further, just so we can get a full roadmap of how this is going to proceed going forward. But this is always going to happen. This is what public awareness and that shift, that massive PR problem that Watchtower has, will lead to. It always will, because it is a fact that it is more dangerous to be born as a Jehovah's Witness than to not be born as a Jehovah's Witness, because of things like the covering up of CSA, the disfellowshipping, which socially isolates you, and that can cause a lot of mental problems, which, is a dangerous situation to be in. Their blood doctrine, it is just a fact that it is more dangerous to be born as a Jehovah's Witness than to not be born as a Jehovah's Witness. And hearing people actually be willing to talk about these in a political setting and willing to open the door to discussion, where they're not going to be whispering about it in a back alley where the governing body can say, oh, these are just those dang apostates always barking up a tree. No, there are political professionals that are taking this seriously, that are watching you. They are now looking and examining at the organization and trying to identify the problems, because if there are problems, they need to change. And these are people that can draft laws, enact laws, get those passed, that will force Watchtower to make changes. So I think this is a glorious day. I was super happy to see all of this. Again, I will put a link in the description if you want to see the entire dialogue and discussion that he talks about, just so you can take a peek-see for yourself. But yep, that's about the TLDR, the nuts and bolts of it. So yeah, stay safe, be kind, and don't forget to spend more time loving the things you love than hating the things you hate. And you better have a good ass day.